Hi, Bob Morrow here from emailhomes.ca and Venture Property Investments. Wanted to talk to you today about lessons we can learn from the Spanish flu, which took place during and just after the First World War. As many of you know, I'm also an author as well as a real estate agent, and with all this downtime, I'm doing a fair amount of writing. I wanted to do some research for a book I will be writing, talking about COVID-19, and some of the research included looking at the Spanish flu. So I wanted to just touch base on a couple of things because I think you might find them interesting. And forgive me if it looks like I'm reading, because that's what I am. I want to make sure I get it right. So the Spanish flu took place between 1918 and 1920. It was called the Spanish flu because the King of Spain got it first, and he was the first famous case. But in actual fact, it was H1N1 the very first time, as was the most recent SARS breakout. But there are very many similarities with the Spanish flu to the COVID-19. The reason it took hold back then was because soldiers were traveling all over the world to get to the First World War. They brought it with them and then took it home afterwards for those that didn't die. A lot of the people, ironically, a lot of the people that died in the war, were accounted as war deaths, who actually were in fact died of the influenza. If you look at some of those movies and you see the trenches and all the men that were sick, that was the Spanish flu they were sick from, and many of them died from that. Even though they had to come out of the trenches and get shot, they would have died from it anyway. So people around the transmission of the flu, of course, is today easily transmitted around the world because just like the soldiers, we travel everywhere. The question of isolation techniques was also discussed back then, just as it is now. And some countries did it better than others, just as is now. One study that I thought was interesting was with the Samoan countries in the South Pacific. Western Samoa was owned by New Zealand and was very slow to put in restrictions. Eventually, they lost 8,000 lives, which is about 27% of the population. The similar island of Eastern Samoa, which was owned by the USA, went into immediate quarantine as soon as the flu pandemic came out and was spared. Since many Western Samoans died from the influenza, the elders, the young people took over. And eventually in the 20s brought the country to civil war. And the country became independent away from New Zealand later on. Eastern Somalia, however, is still a USA protectorate. And what we learned from this is that despite stricter quarantine rules in Eastern Somalia, it's still a U.S. protectorate, and it came out of the pandemic with fewer deaths, and their economy recovered by the end of the 1920s. At the same time, Western Samoa was in the middle of civil war. A couple of other countries. In Australia, quick intense quarantines in 1919 and long distances between the cities helped them stay virus-free until one soldier came back from war and brought the disease to Victoria. However, because it was very late in the game and they had really strict quarantines, some people couldn't even travel from city to city. Less than 1% of the population died. In Japan, very early on, 50,000 people gathered for a protest at Surami Park, and this was a vector for spreading the virus. Eventually, they came up with a vaccine there that wouldn't kill the virus, but would prolong secondary infections like pneumonia. The Western world didn't have that vaccine. So due to a culture that was used to strict obedience, everyone wore masks in Japan, and the infected were isolated immediately. Only 260,000 people died in Japan at that time. Perhaps most significantly, and I found this really interesting, was at the Paris peace talks in 1919. President Wilson, his assistant Edward House, who later died, and both prime ministers from Britain and France were all infected with the Spanish flu. They suffered mild symptoms during the conference, but many feel those symptoms led to the later sickness that killed Wilson. The understanding is also that the sickness around so many people at that time, they were not able to attend important meetings. And because of this, the repatriation that Germany was asked to pay was too strict. The wrong people were in the meetings, or some of the key people were missing. And this caused, the repatriation that was agreed on caused Germany so much hardship that it allowed the acceptance of Hitler's ideals coming into the Second World War. Another interesting fact is that 60 years after the pandemic, so this is the 1980s and the 1990s, there was a spike in cardiovascular deaths in people in their 60s who had been in their 20s during the pandemic. Interesting to think about that. We learned from this that although many people became infected and recovered, who knows what it did to their system and what will show up 50 years from now. So really the better idea is not to get infected at all. And the only way to do that is to stay isolated. The Spanish flu infected 30% of the global population and killed 5% of the people. There are now 7.5 billion people in the world, 4 times as many as back then. Our generation's increase in travel for business and pleasure has reproduced what soldiers in the First World War did, move viruses around the globe. And ironically, the countries that did it well in the 1920s are the same ones that seem to be stamping down the curve now, including Canada. When countries opened up too soon, they saw resurgences of the flu, this time much worse. This happened in France and Spain in the 1920s. Austria is now considering lifting lockdown rules soon, but we believe, or many of us believe, it's too soon. Time will tell to see whether they're right this time. When the government tells us it's okay to go back into public, be aware of history. The virus will never completely disappear. I think it will change the way we do things and certainly change how fast things get back to normal. Real estate will bounce back very quickly. The busy spring season has simply been put on hold till late this summer. Prices won't go down. In fact, they may increase due to the number of buyers in the market. Bidding wars will definitely return, but there will be a glut of inventory, so it'll work itself back to normal over time. So to sum it all up, my advice, don't be too quick to jump back into the market. There will be good homes available, perhaps in places that we weren't looking at before. The possibility of third suites now being incorporated into duplex properties is a phenomenon that's only just started, but there won't be bargain prices out there. So we're still going to make sure the homes we buy in the few months to come will fit the model going forward. If that happens soon, great. But if it takes some time, be willing to wait for the right property. There's going to be a rush of real estate purchases when this thing is lifted and when people are allowed to be back in public. And I think that's going to raise prices artificially for short term. There will likely be a second phase of COVID-19, either in the fall or next spring, and governments will lock down much faster until we have a vaccine. Be prepared. When you buy a house in the next few months, pay special attention to getting the right tenants, ones who can survive a lockdown. History tells us a lot of things, and I think for real estate, looking back at history, especially the Spanish flu, is going to help us get through this. Thanks.